Well, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Alistair McGrath, and I'm the Idris Chair of Science and Religion. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's session of the Ian Ramsey Centre. And there's a lot of interest in special divine action these days, and it's very good indeed to have a Dutch philosopher with us tonight who's going to talk about this, having written about this in what I think is a very interesting book called Chaos, Complexity and God, Divine Action and Scientism. Dr. Taede Smedes is a Dutch philosopher of religion who gained his PhD from the University of Groningen, if I've got that right. And he has developed some very interesting ideas about special divine action, which we're going to be introduced to tonight. And I think you'll find them very stimulating and interesting. One of the points he makes, and I'm sure he'll be elaborating on this tonight, is that very often discussions of special divine action have been influenced excessively by notions derived from science rather than theology, and hence have led to a certain distortion of theological ideas of God and the manner in which God might be said to act in the world. His topic tonight is, why is special divine action a problem? I think it's going to be a very interesting lecture, and we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards. Sir.
Well, first of all, thank you, Alistair McGrath, for introducing me and for inviting me here. Also, Andrew Pinsent, for inviting me here to the Ian Ramsey Centre of Science and Religion, and to Oxford, which is a beautiful, beautiful city with such a rich history. It's a great honor to be here tonight. So, why is special divine action a problem? Well, the title of my paper presupposes that special divine action is a problem. And the question that may rise at this point is it true that special divine action is a problem? And for whom is it a problem? I hope that in this paper I can make clear that there are multiple ways to address these questions. The consensus among theologians and philosophers of religion seems to be that special divine action indeed is a problem. For example, William Alston writes, I quote, "There seems to be a widespread impression in theological circles and among some philosophers who concern themselves with such matters that the idea of God acting in the world is at best problematic, dubious, and puzzling, and at worst incoherent, unintelligible, or radically unacceptable." And Keith Ward writes, "Yet the idea that God acts in the world has become peculiarly problematic, even for those firmly committed to the truth of Christianity. There are many reasons for this, but among intellectual reasons is the astounding success of the post-17th century scientific worldview." Well, many, if not most, scholars in science and religion would agree with Ward that it is science that poses the most pressing challenge for special divine action. In this lecture, I want to explore that idea, but in order to challenge it. In my view, the whole debate about divine action is riddled with confusion, and I hope that I can make it clearer what I believe is really at issue in discussions concerning special divine action. One issue that I will not be dealing with in this lecture, I will say that from the outset, is the problem of evil. I know that, for example, there is this Wesley Wildman in the States who came up with this argument, which I think is so far unpublished, the argument from neglect, which he says is that the problem of evil is a problem for any conception of divine action. And I actually think that he's onto something, but my point in this paper for tonight will be a different one. So I'll leave the problem of evil aside. One of the scholars who can be said to have ignited the fiery discussion about divine action that has dominated the science and religion debate from the early 1960s onwards is Langdon Gilkey. Langdon Gilkey, in his groundbreaking article Cosmology, Ontology and the Travail of Biblical Language from 1961, an article that is nowadays considered a classic in the field, in that article, Gilkey describes what he sees as one of the major problems for modern biblical theology, and that is that it is half liberal and modern on the one hand, and half biblical and orthodox on the other. That is, its worldview or cosmology is modern, while its theological language is biblical and orthodox. What has happened then is that the idea of special divine action has evaporated in liberal theology, according to Gilkey. The idea of God's mighty deeds in nature and history, which pervades the biblical narrative, can nowadays no longer be maintained due to two factors. First, according to Gilkey, there is the idea of a closed causal nexus. And I quote, "The causal nexus in space and time, which Enlightenment science and philosophy introduced into the Western mind, and which was assumed by liberalism, is also assumed by modern theologians and scholars." End of quote. As a result, contemporary theology does not expect, nor does it speak of, wondrous divine events on the surface of natural and historical life. This has resulted in the idea that biblical stories about God's actions are to be taken as merely metaphorical. These events could not really have happened because the spatio-temporal causal nexus of the universe is supposed to be closed. The second factor, according to Gilkey, is semantic in nature. To us, he writes, theological verbs such as to act, to work, to do, to speak, to reveal, etc., have no longer the literal meaning of observable actions in space and time or of voices in the air. The denial of wonders and voices has thus shifted our theological language from the univocal to the analogical, end of quote. According to Gilkey, this results in problems for understanding the language involved. Since we are often unaware of the shift from the univocal to the analogical use of biblical language, confusion arises and we often do not understand what is actually meant when we use biblical language. Note that Gilkey is arguing for a causal structure here. He argues that the problem is that in the shift of cosmology from ancient to modern, fundamental theological concepts have so changed their meaning as almost to have lost all reference. The phrases God acts, God speaks, whatever they may ultimately mean to us, do not signify the wonders and voices of ancient days. Thus, once it was realized that science seems to suggest that the spatio-temporal causal nexus of the universe is closed, liberal theologians realized that we should not take biblical language literally, that is univocally, so they concluded that we should interpret theological language analogically, thereby causing problems for the meaning of the language used. The semantic problem that Gilkey identifies is thus the result of a shift in ontology, which, according to Gilkey, was the result of the influence of science upon theology. Gilkey believes that the result of this development in theology is first, that contemporary theology suffers from internal incoherence. Theologians continue their use of biblically inspired anthropomorphic language about God acting and speaking, while at the same time maintaining that what is really meant by these words is no longer what the biblical writers meant by them. But secondly, the notion of special divine action has evaporated. No longer is divine action identified in terms of specific events in nature and in history. Rather, Gilkey writes, the divine activity became the continual, creative, imminent activity of God, an activity which worked through the natural order and which could therefore be apprehended in universal human experiences of dependence, of harmony, and of value. Experiences which in turn issued in developed religious feeling and religious consciousness. In this latter passage, Gilkey seems to point at those models of divine action that, to use some theological language, take up God's special divine action or special providence into God's general providence. What is meant by this distinction between special and general providence? According to Paul Gwynne, general providence, and I quote, articulates the Christian belief that the world, which utterly depends on God at every moment for its existence, is also designed with an end in mind and is being steered toward that end despite opposing forces. Now, many take this as God setting up appropriate conditions at the beginning to ensure that his creation evolves in certain directions and eventually attains its ultimate destiny. Special divine action is differentiated from God's general providence in that it holds that God's activity is not confined to the creation and conservation of the universe, but that God is active at particular times and places in the universe. So according again to William Alston, God's special divine action denotes that there are occasions on which God brings it about that some particular outcome is different from what it would have been had only only natural created forces been operative. Alston's definition of special divine action as a particular act in time and space with a particular outcome of events that is different from what it would have been if secondary causes would have remained operative is the one that I will adopt for the rest of this paper. So what distinguishes special divine action from God's general providence is the individuality of the providential act. Special providence is analogous to a human decision, and it is for this reason that it is bound up with the idea of God as personal. If I'm to make an analogy, God's general providence can be compared to the normal guidance of an enterprise or a project, whereas God's special divine action can be compared to the unpredictable and ad hoc decisions that sometimes have to be made if the circumstances ask for it, in order to keep the enterprise viable or the project on track. Now, when God's special divine action is taken up into God's general providence, God is no longer said to operate at specific times and in particular places, but the whole of cosmic history is said to be one single divine act. In that case, the problems of special divine action for a scientific worldview seem to evaporate. Now, this model of divine action accordingly is often called the single act approach. And it has been explored by some scholars in religion and philosophy, such as John Hick and John McMurray, but its best known proponents are the theologians Gordon Kaufman and Maurice Wiles, who have proposed different but related models. In his book, God the Problem, from 1972, Kaufman develops the idea of God's master act, in which God is engaged, not the particular and relatively limited events that might first attract our attention. Kaufman writes, "The latter must be regarded as secondary and derivative, to be grasped and interpreted in the light of God's master end, not in their own terms. And this means for a monotheistic theology that it is the whole course of history, from its initiation in God's creative activity to its consummation, when God ultimately achieves his purposes, that should be conceived as God's act in the primary sense." In other words, in Kaufman's view, the entire cosmological and cultural history, from God's creation in the beginning to the eschaton, is one single act of God. Kaufman does admit that there may be some historical events that seem particularly revelatory of God's purposes, yet these are not to be considered special divine acts, but their meaning can only be derived from the entire historical process of which they are a part. In other words, these events are not like ad hoc interventions, but were pre-planned in God's wisdom as part of the entire process. In Kaufman's view, activity proceeding from a single agent and ordered towards a single end, no matter how complex, is properly to be regarded as one act. This whole complicated and intricate theological movement of all nature and history should be regarded as a single, all-encompassing act of God, providing the context and meaning of all that occurs. It is, of course, an act that has not yet run its course, an act that will not be finished until the eschaton, writes Kaufman. Similarly, Maurice Wiles, in his Bampton Lectures, published in 1986 as God's Action in the World, argues that, and I quote, "The primary usage for the idea of divine action should be in relation to the world as a whole, rather than to particular occurrences within it. So that for the theist, who is necessarily committed to a unitary view of the world, the whole process of the bringing into being of the world, which is still going on, needs to be seen as one action of God." Now, in favor of Kaufman and Wiles' models, I think that most theologians do regard God's general providence as a continuing divine act that runs from creation in the beginning up to the eschaton, where God's ends with the universe are fulfilled. Moreover, Wiles and Kaufman also have a point when they assert that some theologians seem rather confused when they argue for general providence and also special divine actions, as if God sometimes has to improvise using special divine acts in order to keep his projects on track. So Kaufman and Wiles do have a point when they argue that the single act approach is theologically coherent. Another obvious advantage of the single act model is that it seems consistent with the scientific worldview, especially because it avoids the problem of divine action as an intervention into the natural order. In the single act approaches of Kaufmann and Wiles, there is no intervention. For there are no particular intervening acts of God. Everything that happens is part of the single act of God. However, there do seem to be a couple of problems with the single act idea. First of all, the notion of divine action becomes meaningless if everything that happens and that makes up the whole of history is part of a single act of God that started in the beginning and that will come to rest at the eschaton. One can no longer make a distinction between what is and what is not an act of God. For according to the single act model, everything that exists and happens is part of the continuous and continuing act of God. Secondly, if everything that happens is part of the single act of God, the single act model may lead to theological determinism. If everything that happens is God's action, then that must include my own actions, my own standing here and talking to you. Creaturely freedom then becomes a questionable feature. In that case, the view of history that forces itself upon us is that what happens in the world is like a movie. The characters seem to act out of free will, but this is merely an illusion, as everything that happens is already captured on film. If everything that happens is part of an act of God, we are mere actors that play out a role. We seem to be acting by our own free will, but everything we do was already and necessarily scripted by a divine director. A third problem with the single act approach is that everything that happens is God act. Is that if everything that happens is God action, then also the evil that happens in the world is God's action, whether God intentionally wanted the evil to happen or not. If God wanted the evil to happen intentionally, then God himself is malicious. If God, on the other hand, could not prevent the evil from happening, for example, the collateral damage was necessary for the entire process to be fulfilled, then that makes God more like a clumsy and irresponsible scientist who started an experiment with no clue as what would happen next. The upshot, obviously, is contrary to the theistic idea of God's perfect goodness and God's worthiness of moral admiration. Because of these and other problems with the single act approach, most theologians and scholars in science and religion do not accept Kaufmann and Wiles' reductionist view on God's general providence, and argue that general providence leaves room for special divine action, including miracles that God performs in God's wisdom. But here we immediately arrive back at where we started. For as Wiles and Kaufmann argue, the single act approach agrees quite comfortably with the scientific worldview, whereas to believe that God performs special divine acts and miracles in our empirical reality seems at odds with the way science describes the world. Now, the traditional solution to circumvent the problem of interventionism is to investigate whether particular domains of science give us an indication that the spatio-temporal nexus of the world is not closed, but fundamentally, that means ontologically open, so that special divine action becomes at least a possibility. Note that the idea is not to discover gaps in our knowledge of the world. The strategy that sponges on scientific ignorance is known as the God of the Gaps approach and is generally regarded as being theologically and philosophically unsound. Modern scholars in science and religion instead have tried to identify ontological gaps, gaps in the spatio-temporal tapestry of reality itself. The task that many scholars in science and religion thus have set themselves, as formulated by Philip Clayton, is not how to prove that God is active in the world at particular moments, but rather how to think this possibility in a manner that does not conflict with what we now know of the world. Most scholars in the field of science and religion have looked at physics in order to find room for special divine action. Indeed, much energy in the field of science and religion is directed towards attempts that put special divine action in a single framework together with the physical sciences. So in his book Chance and Providence from already 1958, William Pollard proposed that God works in the subatomic realm. Interpreting the Heisenberg uncertainty principle in an ontological way, Pollard concluded that at the quantum level there was no determinism. so that the ontological indeterminism there would give God room for action. In the words of Ian Barber, Pollard proposed that God would be the ultimate non-local hidden variable. In later years, scholars like Robert John Russell and John Polkinghorne explored quantum indeterminism and quantum field theory, as did the German theologian Wolfhard Pannenberg, who argued that the quantum field could be compared to the activity of the Holy Spirit. However, it was Arthur Peacock who later suggested that if God really honors the autonomy and integrity of creation, quantum indeterminism is as unpredictable for God as it is for us, and thus useless for action. And Peacock's suggestion was quite influential, so that nowadays a lot of people working in the field of science and religion have left quantum mechanics to locate divine action. In my book, Chaos, Complexity and God, Divine Action and Scientism, I investigated the use of mathematical chaos theory and the interdisciplinary approaches of complexity theory and self-organizing systems in the theological models of John Polkinghorne and Arthur Peacock. In his early works, Polkinghorne still argues for divine action at the quantum level, but he later came to realize that this was not a viable route. In later works, he argued that the mathematical theory of chaotic systems, perhaps in combination with quantum randomness, could result in a plausible argument for an ontologically open universe, in which special divine action was possible without God having to intervene and thus to suspend or violate the natural causal nexus. However, because the mathematics of chaos theory are deterministic and the apparently random behavior of chaotic systems is merely a reflection of our ignorance, Polkinghorne needed to make some questionable metaphysical moves in order to translate the epistemological limitations into ontological limits to make an argument for a causally open universe and thus for the possibility of special divine action. Former biochemist Arthur Peacock used the theory of self-organized complexity to argue for a hierarchically organized but open universe. However, in the end, Peacock argues that even though nature itself is ontologically open, God does not intervene in nature. Instead, so Peacock argues, God voluntarily limits God's omniscience and omnipotence, so that the project of creation can be likened to an experiment of which not even God knows how it will end. There is true randomness, but the interplay between chance and necessity, between randomness and lawfulness, is needed in order for complex structures, including human beings and their culture, to emerge. Peacock's view of divine action seems a radical version of the single act model of Maurice Wildes when he claims, and I quote, "The total network of regular natural events in this perspective is viewed as in itself the creative and sustaining action of God," end of quote. Every natural process in the universe is, in Peacock's view, the action of God as creator. God gives existence in divinely created time to a process that itself brings forth the new. Thereby God is creating. This means we do not have to look for any extra supposed gaps in which, or mechanisms whereby, God might be supposed to be acting as creator in the living world. For Peacock, divine action consisted in making a world that makes itself. Everything that is going on in the universe is God's action. It is through the interplay of chance and necessity that God explores the many possibilities inherent in creation. Okay, let us recap for a moment. Remember that Langdon Gilkey argued it was the scientific worldview that posed a problem for the conceptualization of divine action. Gilkey pointed out that a way to avoid problems with science would be what in later years is called the single act approach. But nowadays the idea of a Newtonian and Laplacian deterministic worldview has become challenged by the sciences, and the single act approach has lost much of its rhetorical force. And yet, special divine action still remains a problem. And those interested in science and religion still keep looking to science to come up with an answer. Some to quantum mechanics, others to chaos theory, and still others to self-organization and emergence. But, one may now ask, what answer could the sciences provide? Why look to science for a solution of a theological or religious issue? These, in my view, foundational questions are hardly ever asked in the field of science and religion. Yet here we arrive at what I consider the core of the problem. Indeed, the problem of divine action, special divine action, is not scientific in nature, contrary to what many scholars in science and religion actually seem to believe, but religious or theological or even downright existential. It has hardly anything to do with the way the sciences describe what the world is like, but it has everything to do with the way we conceptualize God and God's relation to the world. It has everything to do with the theological framing of the problem. And the crucial issue, as I see it, is the conceptualization of God's transcendence. That God is transcendent is one of the core notions of the Christian tradition. However, the continuous struggle has been about what it means to say that God transcends the world. To many people, it means that God is other than the world, or God is beyond the world. However, many people picture this idea of transcendence, of other than and beyond, in a spatial way. Many take transcendence as locating God in a quasi-empirical place, outside all things, as though the world were itself a thing or bounded place one can get outside of. This way of thinking, this spatial picture that has such a firm grip on many of us that we hardly can get outside of it, this picture results in a kind of dualistic thinking. God is not the creation, so God stands opposed to creation. If God is not creation, then God is not where the creation is. So God has to be someplace else. Interpreted in a spatial way, God's transcendence creates a tension with the idea that God is at the same time immanent in creation. For how can God be present and absent at the same time? This idea of transcendence as interpreted in spatial ways, which leads to dualistic forms of thinking, could be seen as a feature of what the philosopher Charles Taylor, in his major work, A Secular Age from 2007, these were actually his Gifford lectures, has called the imminent frame. The imminent frame, according to Taylor, is the framework according to which we think and in which we live our lives. The imminent frame, according to Taylor, depicts the world in terms of a natural order to be contrasted with a supernatural one, an immanent world over against a possible transcendent one. Taylor admits that modern science, and I quote, gave a clear theoretical form to the idea of an immanent order, which could be understood on its own without reference to interventions from outside, while the life of the buffered individual, instrumentally effective in secular time, created the practical context within which the self-sufficiency of this immanent realm could become a matter of experience. End of quote. Accordingly, in our secular age, the world is experienced as a closed world structure. A closed or horizontal world which leaves no place for the vertical or transcendent, but which in one way or another closes these off, renders them inaccessible or even unthinkable. What Taylor describes is that in this immanent frame, we are presented with different pictures of how things are. Referring to Wittgenstein's idea of a picture that holds us captive, Taylor argues that each picture becomes a background to our thinking, within whose terms it is carried on, but which is often largely unformulated and to which we can frequently, just for this reason, imagine no alternative. Modern science can become such a captivating picture. And I mean not only that the knowledge of the different sciences present us with a picture of what the world is like, of how the universe is structured, its history and evolution from the Big Bang up to the present, which forces are at work in it, etc. No, I mean something like what Michael Stenmark has in mind when he writes in his book on scientism, and I quote, "We depend not only practically on science in our lives, the theories and methods of science also shape our thinking and our attitudes." The picture not only has a content of its own, but it is also the background to our thinking. Now, the idea is that science not only presents us with a picture of what the world is like, but the picture itself seems often to be accompanied by a set of implicit normative claims with regard to how we should think about the world. The Wittgensteinian philosopher Rush Rees wrote that, and I quote extensively, "Science may influence our understanding of things in other ways, not by what it teaches us about them, but, or so it is said, by the way in which it teaches us to look at them. The scientific outlook, it is held, need not be confined to the special inquiries of science. It is largely a matter of adopting scientific methods in what we do. And a scientific age would treat all problems in that way." End of quote. All problems treated in the same way as special inquiries of science. This is, in my view, what has happened as scholars in the field of science and religion have come to reflect on the possibility of special divine action within the framework of the modern sciences. Special divine action is assumed to be a special inquiry of science. Science not only pictures how things are, but also delivers the imminent framework that sets the rules for how we think. Rees admits that we do not apply scientific methods always and everywhere in our daily lives. And yet, the prevalence of science, he writes, affects the way we think of things or look at things, besides the special matters which it investigates. It may affect the way in which we understand questions in religion or in art, for instance, even if we are not trying to introduce scientific methods into them. So in Rees's view, the influence that science has upon our lives also extends to matters of religion and theology, even though we are mostly not aware of this influence. The picture that science presses upon us, the imminent frame, has become the background against which matters of religion and theology are being discussed. It has become the framework whereby we have come to rule out certain questions and certain sorts of explanations. Rees illustrates the influence of this framework by referring to the differences between the role of miracles in 13th century theological reasoning compared to today's view of what is considered evidence in an argument. And I quote Rees, "If anyone were to speak about religious doctrines now in the way in which he might have spoken in the 13th century, we should hardly listen to him. Not so much because he would be offering views which science has shown to be wrong, but because his whole way of arguing or presenting his case would seem unconvincing to us. It would not strike us as an argument at all. We might call it a verbal subterfuge, and we should not understand how anyone could be impressed by it. Consider the evidence that was supposed to be afforded by miracles. The difficulty is not because science has shown that there can be no miracles. How could it show that? Our difficulty is partly in understanding what a miracle could be. And this is a result of our scientific ideas, a result of the mass of preconceptions from which we start and which we cannot escape regarding how things should be viewed. And we find it even more difficult to see what could be meant by accepting a miracle as evidence for anything. For those who did accept them, they obviously had a force which we just cannot understand. And this is not because science has shown that they were wrong in finding such force in them. But the scientific treatment of natural events has come to take our attention and play a role in our lives as it never did for them. And we cannot move outside it in our thinking. End of quote. Our idea of what a miracle or special divine action could be has changed, according to Rees, due to the influence of science. This is in accordance with Charles Taylor's view, who writes that it was the mechanical outlook that split nature from supernature and that led to our modern concept of miracle, a kind, I quote Taylor now, a kind of punctual hole blown in the regular order of things from outside, that is, from the transcendent. Whatever is higher must thus come about through the holes pierced in the regular natural order, within whose normal operation there is no mystery. End of quote. It is this concept of divine action, through the holes pierced in the regular natural order, that has set the agenda for the modern science and religion debate. It is this view that has made special divine action into a problem. Now, theologians who are active within the imminent frame think and act within that framework and according to its rules. Thus, many of them struggle with the notion of God's transcendence. Accordingly, the situation they see themselves confronted with can be described in the following way. If one takes God's transcendence seriously, then one first of all has to acknowledge that God is not part of the natural order. But what if God, who is outside the natural order, wants to act in the universe? Now, in that case, there are two options. Either God must intervene in the natural order by temporarily suspending or disabling the natural order, that is, intervening, or the universe must somehow be open to divine influence. Now, most theologians and scholars in science and religion nowadays dismiss the interventionist view, and thus they are left with a search for what Austin Farrer has famously called the causal joint, the spot where the finite and the infinite meet, where creaturely causality and the impact of the Creator come together. But what is presupposed here? The theologian Andrew Porter argues that many discussions concerning divine action are an exercise in what he calls theological naturalism, and that seeks to describe divine action in the same terms that in other parts of life are used to describe natural phenomena. With regard to special divine action, this theological naturalism comes down to the following presupposition, and I quote Porter. It is as if for God to act in the world, something in the world has to move over to make room for God to act. There has to be a hole cut in the world to make space for God to act. For God to act, he has to push on something. And for that to happen, ordinary forces have to stop pushing on that something. Or he has to add his own force on top of whatever natural forces are also pushing on the thing that he has to move in order to act. It assumes that for God to act, he has to come into the world and act the same way that other actors act in the world. End of quote. The theological naturalist thus assumes that imminence can only work by pushing aside a part of the intramundane to make room for the imminent presence of transcendence. Something can be an imminent presence, or it can be intramundane, but it can't be both at once. It's a bit like soccer. There are 11 players on the playing field, and some reserve players on the bench. God is apparently assumed to be one of the reserve players, who is allowed to play on the field only if one of the 11 regular players drops out. So underlying the search for the possibility of divine action within the imminent framework of the natural sciences, one can again discern a strong but dangerous dualistic either-or logic. The theological danger emerges once we realize that the strategy of searching for the possibility of divine action in ontological gaps actually implies that God's action and the workings of the natural order are in competition with each other. Creaturely activity, for example, laws of nature, are assumed to be in competition with God's activity, as if the two act on the same ontological level. However, this argument ignores a crucial distinction between God and the world that is also an aspect of talk about God's transcendence. As creator of the universe, God is assumed to be of a different order than the creaturely. God cannot be compelled or constrained by the powers inherent in the universe. Because God is beyond the laws of nature, God transcends them. Many discussions concerning divine action thus rest upon a category mistake. They confuse the logic implicit in speaking about the natural order with the logic implicit in talking about the order of the divine. This category mistake, however, has a very radical theological consequence. Note that in the case of a competition between God and world, God is constrained by the world. So that if God wants to act, something in the world has to make room. Now, the theologian Colin Gunton once remarked, whatever constrains God's actions from without is effectively God. Scholars that search for ontological gaps in the world for God to act in or through thus effectively deny that God is God. One can thus discern an implicit atheism entailed by these models, even though the scholars who construct them mainly are motivated by religious and even apologetic intentions. The category mistake can also be elucidated by referring to the philosophical distinction between what is logically and what is physically possible. In my opinion, underlying many models of divine action is a metaphysical postulate which entails a reduction of what is logically possible to what is physically or scientifically possible. In philosophy, the set of physical possibilities is a subset of the broader and actually infinite set of logical possibilities. The set of physical possibilities is a subset of the set of logical possibilities. So the set of physical possibilities is contained in, and therefore smaller than, the set of logical possibilities. That I would jump as high as to overcome the pull of gravity and fly off into space may be impossible from a physical or scientific point of view, but it still remains a logical possibility which may be exploited in, for example, a science fiction story. Or that a human being should rise from the dead after 3 days may be scientifically implausible, and by some even considered impossible, judged on the basis of our present knowledge about death and decay of the human body. And yet it remains a logical possibility. Basically, the distinction between logical and physical possibility or impossibility can be stated as that logical impossibilities yield a contradiction, while physical impossibilities do not. As the philosopher Mark Sainsbury writes, what is logically possible or impossible typically issues from the very nature of the concepts involved and is not beholden to the laws of nature. It is logically possible for the laws of nature to be very different from what they actually are. Thus, it is a contradiction that means logically impossible that Jack is a married bachelor, since the concept of a bachelor entails that he is unmarried. And that I am in the position of a round cube is also logically impossible, since a round cube is a contradiction. Such logical impossibilities also entail physical impossibilities. But there is no contradiction involved in saying that if I had a long enough rope, I could pull the moon down to Earth. It is logically, but not physically, possible. So philosophically speaking, then what is physically possible is also logically possible, since the set of physical possibilities is a subset of the infinite set of logical possibilities. But it doesn't go the other way around. Not everything that is logically possible is also physically possible, since the laws of nature constrain what is physically possible. Now, what happens in discussions concerning divine action, however, is that the distinction between logical and physical possibilities is collapsed, so that the set of logical possibilities now becomes reduced to what is merely physically possible. Theological naturalism tacitly assumes that God is active on the same ontological level as the rest of nature, so that what is possible for God also is tacitly assumed to entail what is physically or scientifically possible. Theologians throughout the centuries have held that God can bring about all logically possible states of affairs that accord with his nature in the world. But now, according to theological naturalism, the possibility of God's domain of possible actions has been reduced to the merely physically possible, which means that God's action must work in accordance with the laws of nature that constrain physical possibility. So while many scholars in the field of science and religion will explicitly confirm that God is transcendent and deny that God works as a cause among causes, they tacitly assume a model of transcendence which locates God someplace else, but still at the same ontological category as our physical universe. God is merely living next door to Alice. The universe is assumed to be, to use Taylor's term, a closed world structure, and this means that for God to act, God's actions are constrained by the rules of physical possibility. But it also means that for God's action to become a physical possibility, the universe must somehow be causally open for God to be able to act in it. Thus, due to the emergence of what Taylor calls the imminent frame in our Western society, which emerged partly because of the influence of science upon our ways of thinking and acting, thinking about God's action has become constrained to physical and mechanistic categories, thereby letting the transcendent God compete with intramundane physical and mechanistic causes. My conclusion thus is that scholars in science and religion are held captive by the picture that governs this imminent frame. The question now is there a way out? Charles Taylor writes in the spirit of Wittgenstein, and I quote, "We can sometimes be completely captured by the picture, not even able to imagine what an alternative would look like. Or we can be in somewhat better shape, capable of seeing that there is another way of construing things, but still having great difficulty making sense of it." End of quote. Now, is there another way to construe divine transcendence in a way that allows for rethinking divine action? Now, I'm not so sure that rethinking divine action is an option, and I will explain why in a minute. However, I do think that rethinking divine transcendence is possible, although this requires a change in our way of conceptualizing. As said, the problem with divine action eventually comes down to an interpretation, to an ontological interpretation, or a picture of what speaking about transcendence means. The spatial picture of God's reality as being spatially separated from created reality seems to depict an ontological state of matter. Transcendence, indeed, is often interpreted in ontological terms. Now, my tentative proposal is to take God's transcendence not as an ontological claim, but as a regulative principle, not unlike a grammatical rule in a language that is used to determine which sentences can and which cannot be properly formed to be meaningful. Perhaps the notion of God's transcendence is used in theology as a way of determining what can and what cannot be meaningfully said about God. God's transcendence thus belongs to the grammar of God talk. Perhaps, taken as a regulative principle, God's transcendence is merely trying to state the rule that because God is not part of the created order, therefore any limitation that limits human action and that is bound up with the created order is supposed to be no limitation for God. In that case, God's transcendence can be interpreted as God's being other than the universe in being beyond its limits and limitations. God's transcendence states that the created reality can in no way constrain God's being and presence. So any theological model that somehow lets God's being and presence become reduced to or constrained by creation is therefore to be considered theologically inappropriate or inadequate. Now, if that is the case, this means that when talking about God's action, we should bear in mind the philosophical distinction between physical and logical possibilities. Science deals with physical possibilities. But since God is not a part of the created order, what is possible for God may surpass the domain of what is physically possible. In that case, we also need to avoid dualist categories of thought, thus transcending the opposition between transcendence and imminence. Indeed, as Kathryn Tanner has argued, and I quote, "It is the mutual exclusiveness of all apparent antitheses, not just that of transcendence and imminence, which must give way before such a God." End of quote. Now, transcendence and imminence are often treated as mutually exclusive predicates. However, as Tanner points out, only created beings which remain themselves over against others risk the distinctness of their own natures by entering into intimate relations with another. God's transcendence alone is one that may be properly exercised in the radical immanence by which God is said to be nearer to us than we are to ourselves. End of quote. In other words, the being of created beings is such that immanence and transcendence, self and other, are mutually exclusive categories. Becoming someone else, becoming another, entails losing oneself. However, transcendence, as being beyond the limits and limitations that characterize the creaturely, also transcends the duality of self and other. Indeed, as Tanner emphasizes, it is only as transcendent that God can be immanent in ways we cannot even conceive. We can point to the logical possibility, but that is all. No further description or explanation is available to us. We thus also cannot rule out the logical possibility of divine action. Austin Farrer has coined the term double agency to indicate that both creaturely causality and divine agency may be present and active at the same time, and thus annihilating the dualist idea that an action of mine is either a basic action for which I am responsible or an action for which God is responsible. Indeed, the mutual exclusiveness of my responsibility for a basic action and my not being responsible in case of God's action through me may hold from our limited creaturely perspective, but may not limit the transcendent God, although our cognitive powers are not able to conceive how both can go together without one losing from the other. And the set of all logical possibilities that God has at God's disposal is, like God's self, infinite, beyond our imagination and comprehension. We need to recognize that our imagination, that is what we consider physically and logically possible, is closely bound up to our finitude and situatedness, which is part of what it means to be a creature. Like our senses, our imagination is constrained by our life world, the reality in which we live and breathe and have our being. It would be foolish to let our ideas about what is real be determined by what we as humans can experience and conceive. In the case of God, there is a danger of transforming our limited ideas about God into new pictures that, as if by magic, cast a spell on us and hold us captive. Indeed, it is here that apophatic theology or negative theology is recognized by an increasing number of philosophers of religion to have an adequate contribution to make. A theology that denies all that is positively stated about God. Such a theology can make us sensitive to the pitfalls that lie before us when thinking and talking about God. Indeed, as the American theologian William Plaker writes, and I quote, "Human reason cannot figure its way to such a God, since a God we could figure out, a God fitted to the categories of our understanding, would therefore not be transcendent in an appropriately radical sense. We can know the transcendent God not as an object within our intellectual grasp, but only as a self-revealing subject. And even our knowledge of divine self-revelation must itself be God's doing." True, Plaker's view leads us into the tricky theological territory of how we can think revelation, but that is something I must bypass for now. However, the warning against what Plaker calls the domestication of transcendence is obvious, and was in a sense what inspired me to look closely at attempts of scholars in science and religion to think about the possibility of divine action in the first place. So is God able to act in created reality? Perhaps, but I would like to stress my ignorance at that point, although to some that may be rather disappointing. I do not know whether God acts, nor do I know how God acts. I do not know if miracles really can happen. I do not know whether God uses special effects in the use of miracles, or whether God acts more subtly by allowing us to perceive God's presence and activity through symbolic representation. All I know is that religious believers speak about God's presence and activity in their lives. And I agree with scholars like the Wittgensteinian philosopher D.C. Phillips that no pseudo-scientific theory of divine action is appropriate when it comes to such confessions. Indeed, whether such experiences are real or not is irrelevant to the experience itself. Answering those questions is merely a way of satisfying our scientific curiosity, or even to console our own lingering religious doubts. Faith in God entails a basic trust, an affirmation of the basic goodness of reality, a basic trust that precedes any justification and resists all explanation. As I see it, a believer who asks for an explanation exhibits already some of the symptoms that point to an erosion of faith. An erosion of that basic trust that slowly becomes transformed into a seeking for epistemological certainty that for us humans is nowhere to be found, and that so easily leads to desperation and desolation. It is only then that divine action becomes a problem. So when it comes to the special divine action, the appropriate religious stance, in my view, is that one keeps an open mind, a mind that is as empty of preconceptions as possible. Perhaps we should become like children who live without expectation or worries, who accept the world and what happens as gifts from grace. Perhaps we shouldn't think too much, since thinking begets worries. Often our worst enemies are simply our own thoughts and ideas, which pose a filter through which we look at the world without really seeing. Perhaps we should just take the world as it gives itself, by resting in the moment and accepting every moment as a gift from grace. As adults, we should train ourselves in what in Zen is called a beginner's mind. The Zen master Shunryu Suzuki put it into words with which I end this paper. If your mind is empty, it is always ready for anything. It is open to everything. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure we'd all like to thank Dr. Smedes for a very engaging and very clear exposition of a very important theme. We come to a time of questions. Perhaps I could just ask one to get things going, and then we'll wander around you with the microphone so you can be picked up on the tape. Do you think the situation you've described has arisen from the aggressiveness of scientists or from the subservience of theologians?
Well, that is indeed an either-or question, and I hope to be able to avoid that kind of that trap. Now, I think it simply has arisen due to the cultural configuration, which I think, well, emerged at least during the Enlightenment, but of which, of course, there are traces going back to nominalism, so to the Middle Ages already. So I don't think there is anyone to blame, in a sense, for this way of thinking. But it's simply something, at least it has something to do with the influence that science has in our culture, an influence which has grown since the Enlightenment, and which is still very, very pervasive and becoming even more pervasive now with the also with the discussions from the new atheists and so on, who really press the issues towards you either accept science and you have to become an atheist because that's the only logical conclusion that you can draw, or you remain ignorant and you therefore become religious. And so that's a choice that they pose to people, and in which people have a lot of difficulty seeing rooms for alternatives.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I think your point was very well made, that God is not limited by the ways the universe is, and that there's no logical contradiction between God acting and laws of nature operating, human free will operating, etc. But I think that this treatment of God's distinctness from the universe leaves unaddressed the matter of how God and the universe would be connected when he acts. And I think this leaves a particular problem unaddressed. If God acts so as to affect the universe, then the effect would be physical and possibly empirical, and that would mean that the character of the causal relation would be the character of one of the sort of empirically identifiable types of causality. And these are not transcendent things. These are just the regular old things that we have models for. So you've argued that God would not act on these terms, but I think that it's necessary, and to at least some extent, that he would act in these terms.
Well, the issue that I wanted to raise in the paper is, first of all, we do not know whether God acts and also how God acts. All we have is, in a sense, people who confess that they have felt God's activity in their lives, and these go through the ages. I mean, even the Bible obviously writes about that. So that is, I think, a fact that we simply have to address. As to how that happens, I don't know. I don't think that we can get to that point of knowing how God acts and whether or not that has anything. Perhaps it doesn't even have to have physical changes. It simply can become an awareness that some people have. Like, for example, what the psychiatrist Jung called synchronicities. Synchronicities are simply natural events that happen, which have natural explanations, but that for the people who actually experience those coincidences have a very special meaning. Perhaps God acts through that way. That would mean that we don't even have to have physical of alterations of the physical universe, but there is a kind of awareness that there's something more going on than meets the eye. That is a possibility. I don't know, but I mean, we have those kinds of confessions of people. What I was trying to get at is that in our thinking about the possibility of God's action, we should not let ourselves be constrained or caught into this kind of framework, which in a sense forces us into a kind of either-or dualism, or has to, so that God is either have to intervene into the law, into the physical reality, or that the physical reality is acting completely autonomously, so that God is not involved anyhow. This kind of dualistic thinking, I think, it's being pressed on us by the sciences who are so influenced. So it's this kind of cultural scientism, as I sometimes call it, which has forced us this picture. But on the other hand, I think that we should be critical about our way of thinking. I mean, the social psychology and psychology in general is nowadays having all these ideas about how we actually fool ourselves in thinking that we are very rational in our ways of thinking, which we're actually fooling ourselves. Well, it may be that this kind of either-or thinking is actually also fooling ourselves, and is actually keeping us away from reality. We don't see reality as it really is, because our way of thinking is acting as a kind of filter. So I didn't really try to give answers. I tried to raise a kind of awareness that the way we think about the world may not actually be how the world really is, and the same goes for God. So I hope that answers a little bit your question.
Thank you. I wonder how you would take, or whether you think it's relevant, the sort of antinomian statements of, for instance, St. Paul in the New Testament, like, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, because it is God who worketh in you to do and to will of his good pleasure, which, strikes one as totally contradictorily in a logical way.
I think there may actually be quite a lot of wisdom in those kinds of words. I think there are people here in the audience which are way more of Aquinas scholars than I am. But also in Thomas Aquinas, there seems to be not really a kind of dichotomy or an antagonism between God's action and creaturely action. They both go together without the one necessarily has to confirm the other. But I mean, it's our way of scientific thinking in which we tend to construct these kinds of mutual exclusiveness. So perhaps we should take St. Paul a little bit more seriously than we often tend to do. No.
The father of the church, the 4th century, because I know better about them, didn't feel any problem. They saw God in terms of a relationship. So it's a personal relationship which each of us have with the transcendent. But that didn't stop them from explaining the Genesis in evolutionary terms, not as we think, not literary. So they were updated to the sense of their time. So Basil of Caesarea edited a book of Democritus. So they were apparently idealists, and Democritus was completely materialist, but they didn't have any problem with that. There are not contradiction in the 4th century. So maybe we should read the fathers more, and then we won't have so many problems, I think. Because it looks like we reinvent the wheel, and there's no need for that.
It's true. I agree completely. I also think that what often happens, in a sense, we would need more kind of theological scholarship in that direction, and also perhaps more popular theological scholarships, theologians who are able to really popularize those kinds of ideas. Because I think that a lot of theologians would read the early church father or even Thomas Aquinas from our now 21st century view. So if Thomas, for example, speaks about causes, we tend to take that as a kind of scientific, to talk about causality as from our scientific point of view, whereas Thomas, for example, saw no really contradiction in God's causality and creaturely causality. So you're entirely right that I think that perhaps we should take those ways of thinking much more seriously than we do now. Yeah.
I have found some kind of element of very serious simplification in your suggestions that there is kind of logical and physical impossibility. I suppose in real term, in today terms, it's kind of a simplification because mathematics cannot be reduced to logic. Physics cannot be reduced to some kind of only mathematical kind of doctrine or something like. This means that we must suppose kind of logical impossibility, mathematical impossibility, and physical impossibility. More than we cannot say we have knowledge of the beginning of mathematics and the end of mathematics. It's evolving, its process is becoming, as well as logic is something becoming. We have not limits of logic. We have not limits of physics today. This means that in order to present some kind of more holistic picture, we must suppose some kind of more sophisticated picture.
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't mean to give a kind of a view that I mean, what is considered as physical possibility or a logical possibility? I mean, that is. I didn't give example. I gave examples of physical and logical possibility, but we don't know what the limits of physical possibility are, or what the limits of what the limits of logical possibility are. We don't know at all because those are the set of logical possibilities is infinite. So there are logical possibilities which we cannot even imagine. And the same may go for physical possibilities. So I'm not saying that they are not also not antagonistic. I said that the set of all physical possibilities, even those we don't know yet, so natural laws we still have to discover or anything, is a subset of the entire set of logical possibilities. So I wasn't trying to be antagonistic in the sense of saying we only have these two kinds of possibilities, but because there are possibilities which we don't know in what set they belong to. For example, the possibility that extraterrestrial life exists. For now, it's in the realm of logical possibility because we don't know whether or not extraterrestrial life really exists elsewhere. When we have discovered that extraterrestrial life exists elsewhere, then it has become a physical possibility.
So Steve Horst, who is a philosopher of science, recently sent me a paper. So I'm wondering what you think about his idea. So he says that this whole idea about the incompatibility between the laws of nature as we know them and God's seeming impossibility to act in it, he says it's actually a sort of old-fashioned concept of science as a sort of, the clockwork, the Laplacian clockwork. But, more recent philosophers of science like Nancy Cartwright see the world more as a sort of dappled universe with laws that, they don't cover the whole. It's like this all these local laws by which you can explain things, but, they don't overlap to make this sort of. So I wonder what you think about that idea. Would that make for a more congenial view to explain how God could act in a universe like that?
Oh, no doubt there would be scholars in science and religion who would welcome Nancy Cartwright's view of a dappled universe. The thing is, for me, if you look at the history of science, you see that there are kind of that there are ideas which are in fashion. For example, the Newtonian idea of a deterministic clockwork universe, well, it wasn't even Newtonian, but it came after Newton. It was inspired by Newton. That was in fashion for a while, and then came quantum mechanics, which seemed to overthrow that. So all of a sudden, an indeterministic worldview came into fashion. And nowadays, we have this kind of mixture where there are some people who, for example, the new atheists, seem to believe that we have this, that our universe actually is a kind of closed world structure that Charles Taylor is writing about. So I guess that there would be a lot of scholars in science and religion who would welcome Nancy Cartwright's view, who would say, well, this dappled universe, there are parts which are deterministic and parts which are governed by randomness. So this gives a kind of openness for God to intervene in. Yeah, but what if in 10 years' time there comes a new theory, for example, Stephen Hawking's theory of everything is being discovered, and it turns out that everything is deterministic after all, even though we don't know it. Then the fashion goes the other way around, and theology has to adapt to that again. I think the way of that, we shouldn't let the sciences decide, or the fashion of thinking about the sciences decide how we as theologians and philosophers of religion should think about God. But we should first of all say, well, what do we actually mean when we say that God is transcendent? What is meant by that throughout the Christian tradition? So from St. Paul until nowadays, what have theologians said when they talked about God's transcendence, and then go on to say, well, could we relate that to a view of the world which would more or less connect with the way people experience the world nowadays, or perhaps even open up that world, because I think transcendence also is also meant to break boundaries of our conceptualization of our way of viewing the world. So as attractive as it may seem to grip on Nancy Cartwright's view and to make that a kind of canonical view in science and religion, I would say, well, I would be very careful to make such a move and to actually really reconsider what you're doing when you make that move.
Thank you for an excellent talk, and also for identifying so clearly the issue of framing, the way that problems are framed and constrained. But I want to particularly pick up one issue, this notion of causation, because it strikes me that so many of the debates are about causation and perhaps a rather limited notion of causation. If you were a school teacher today, I'd like to ask you, how would you like to teach the children, students about causes to give them a richer toolkit? What would you like to teach about causation? Thank you.
Yeah, if you, in my view, if you open a philosophy of science book, you get a notion of causation, and then you open up another by a different author, you get another definition. It's very difficult. I think what I see happening is that more and more philosophers of science are simply turning back to Hume and say, well, it's a kind of way we view the world. We see that something is happening which changes a state of affairs, and we don't know exactly how it happens, but we see it happens, and we call that a cause and an effect. I would simply go with the billiard ball model and to say, well, this is how we see cause and effect. I don't know if that really answers your question. I'm not a philosopher of science in that way. I read quite a lot of philosophy of science. But eventually, it's the problem I have with philosophy of science is that if you come up with a definition, there are many scientists who say, well, that's simply not how things work. There is a discrepancy, seeming discrepancy, between a lot of philosophy of science and the way science at least perceives philosophy of science. So it's difficult. But at least I wouldn't draw divine action into it in any way.
Thank you very much for a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. John Polkinghorne is not very happy with Austin Farrer's strategy of leaving the double agency, the causal joint, in a mist of a shroud of mist or something like that. No, he says. For as much as I read Farrer's work, he's quite happy with leaving it like that. But Polkinghorne is not, because he's more optimistic, and he thinks that we should not give up on understanding how God can act, whatever that means. Actually, Polkinghorne doesn't really say what that means, right? But Farrer didn't have the chance to respond to Polkinghorne, and since I understood in your final remarks something very similar to Farrer's position, I wonder what would you tell Polkinghorne if he would come and say, well, your position just doesn't tell us much when saying we shouldn't try to understand which is simply acknowledge that we don't know how God acts. What would you say to that?
Yeah, it's difficult to respond to that. I had some discussions with Polkinghorne and also with Peacock. Peacock was also so friendly when he was still alive to send me a large letter after my a book was published, in which he responded and said, of course, that I had completely misunderstood his ideas. Polkinghorne did more or less the same, but it's difficult to argue because I understand somehow the urgency that they feel to get to this understanding, but I think it also may have to do something with their. They both were scientists in a kind of previous life. I mean, Polkinghorne was a quantum mechanic or quantum physicist, and Peacock was a biochemist. So what they wanted to do was to gain more understanding through their doing science, and in some sense. They are doing what Ross Rees is actually doing. They're making their theology into a kind of scientific enterprise as well. They draw the activities and methods and ways of thinking of science into theology and make theology into a kind of scientific inquiry, which I can understand because that is the way we do things in our culture. But I do think that we should also take seriously the very strong tradition, not so much nowadays, although I think it's gaining momentum again, but at least the apophatic or negative theology has had a profound influence on theology throughout the ages. And it seems that nowadays the positive theology, the way of model building, so to say, seems to have taken over. To the extent that we try if we don't get it into a kind of picture that we can see and that we can understand, it seems to be irrelevant. It has to become irrelevant to us, and I think that is something that we should ask ourselves whether that is really a good way to go about. I mean, in our daily lives, there are so many things which we don't understand, which we don't think are irrelevant. It's really difficult to answer it because I understand it, but I also try to resist the urge for understanding, and I do acknowledge that I don't even know whether God exists or not. All I know is that, for example, for me personally, I can't get away from finding God an interesting issue. I mean, I circle around it completely, and in my entire life. Does that make me a theist? No, because at least not a theist in the sense that a theist believes in an omnipotent or a personal God or something. Sometimes I do, but sometimes I circle around it, and sometimes I'm more agnostic, even sometimes more atheistic. If I read two evangelical kinds of tractates, I'm more into a kind of atheistic mood. So it's that depends. But God for me is a mystery, and I'm completely content with that. The thing is, to say one more thing, it may actually be that this kind of need for explanation actually reveals a kind of deep existential insecurity. The being afraid of the wanting to know also can be a kind of wanting to control things. Knowledge is power. So knowing God, in a sense, it can also be a way of now we know how to deal with it. And perhaps there is some Kierkegaardian anxiety underneath those kind of models like Polkinghorne's and Peacock's, which is again completely understandable. But I don't think that is the fruitful way of doing theology.
Time for two more questions, and we have two down here. First question.
Thank you. First of all, forgive me for dashing in and out. I've got a puppy in the car, and he requires attention. I also wish to thank you from the bottom of my heart, because I think you have recovered the mystery of God. And for so many years, whilst I've been growing up, There has been no mystery. The mystery is gone. God doesn't exist. Finished. This book, which I'd like you to take, contains an account of something that happened to me 40 years ago, in which I was abruptly picked up from a psychiatric hospital bedroom. I was translated to the edge of the universe, where I met an entity which embraced me, gave me the answer to what I needed to know, and sent me back again in a blink. The response of scientists is to say, well, that couldn't happen, Colin. The universe is too big. So the matter of how it affected me is to answer Andrew's question. I became a teacher of mathematics. And I decided that in my lessons, I would try to show my pupils that their lives are essentially self-selective. They have to learn never to say they understand when they do not, never to accept an argument that they haven't proven for themselves. And that's what teachers can do today. And they're not doing it. We're ending up with lots of children who are actually dishonest. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you believe there's spirituality, and how would you explain spirituality in your model?
Did you mean, do I believe in a spiritual reality, or do I...
Spiritual human being as a
spiritual being. Yes, I definitely do believe that. I don't know, I mean, I'm not really interested in questions about the soul or anything, but I do think that we are very spiritual beings, and I mean that this also in a sense goes beyond my competency to speak, but I can only do so by becoming very personal. But I do feel that I'm becoming, for example, more and more interested in the word of Meister Eckhart, and into, for example, Buddhist ideas that are non-dualistic, go into non-dualistic ways of thinking. I think there's for us Westerners, there's a lot to learn there, in the sense that they break through our dualistic conceptuality of the world and say, well, we don't. If we break through the conceptuality, there is a kind of silence there, because our way of thinking is very much steeped into dichotomous thinking. We do that automatically. It's even in the Bible. If you read the story of Samuel, the calling of Samuel, if Samuel is called by God as a small child in the middle of the night, the interesting thing is that he doesn't already assume that it's a kind of supernatural being that calls him. He thinks it's Eli. So he goes to Eli's room. So he already assumes that there's a natural explanation for the voice that he hears. That is so deeply embedded within us, that kind of search for a naturalistic explanation for anything, for everything. And I come more and more to the awareness that, well, that actually may be a kind of very human tendency and inclination to do that, but perhaps it is it may not be the way that reality is. So in that sense, yeah, it has for me a kind of a spiritual spiritual thing that I cannot really put into words. Words actually fail, but at least I hope that, for example, through this lecture, I can add, and I think that it happens in many other disciplines as well. We can go to the in principle kind of boundaries of our thought, where we say, okay, here, for example, it seems at least, I'm not a quantum physicist, but it seems at least that, for example, the wave-particle duality goes beyond our real understanding of what is going on there. But still, that's apparently the way how reality is. It's something, sometimes it can be a particle, sometimes, and at the same time, it behaves as a wave, or something like that. So how reality is may not be how we conceptualize it. Immanuel Kant already knew that, and so for me, that is a kind of a spiritual knowledge, so to say.
Creature, we believe the believers of God is without spirituality. You cannot. You cannot explain the whole science and religion with, and then you put the spiritualists aside. Then you are missing the large part of the God believers.
That may be so, but on the other hand, I don't know exactly. I think that what spirituality means is different for everybody. So I mean, I would never say, for example, that Polkinghorne, in his kind of rationalistic way of doing science and religion, is lacking spiritual awareness or something. No, I think actually that his drive in doing science and religion is itself a kind of an expression of his spirituality. So that, and it goes for many others as well. So I wouldn't say that there are people in science and religion who are not spiritual, because I don't know whether or not they are not spiritual. Their spirituality may not be mine, but that doesn't mean that they're not spiritual.
And there, I'm afraid, we must leave it. Let me, on your behalf, thank Dr. Smedes very much indeed, I thought, for an excellent talk, but also some very feisty and engaging responses to some very good questions. We meet again in 2 weeks. Thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again then. Thank you.